Hello and welcome to Dialogue. More than 1,500 global business and government leaders are currently in Tianjin for this year's Summer Davos session of the World Economic Forum, where Chinese Premier Li Qiang has affirmed China's support for foreign companies and criticized Western efforts to limit trade and business ties with the country. What are the potential risks of the de-risking strategy pursued by some countries? What challenges are entrepreneurs facing in the world today, and what are China's plans to boost economic growth for 2023? To discuss these issues and more, I'm glad to be joined by Professor Liu Baocheng from the University of International Business and Economics, and as Hiwo Kabrat, Development Finance Advisor at Development Reimagined, and Dr. William Li, Chief Economist of the Milken Institute. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Break. William, of course, when we talk about or when we stress about the, communication, openness, the cooperation, often it's because there's a lacking of such a practice, let's say. And against such a background, of course, there's the talk or the strategy of de-risking. Share with us your understanding of de-risking, or what are the risks? Is there a clear definition?
I think the risks that we're talking about came about because of COVID. I think the world recognized that concentrated production and supply chains that were stretched around the world created vulnerabilities for different countries and also for China, because China became the center supplier for the whole world. And if China shut down because of COVID, that threatened not just the rest of the world, but also China's own good economic health. So for me, the risks that we are talking about, that we want to de-risk, is to really reshape globalization. The globalization right now means everyone should do what they're good at and do less of what they're not good at. Well, a lot of people are good at wanting to have more security. And in doing so, we have to reshape the supply chain so that they're less stretched, they're less concentrated. And I think that's the kind of issue that we need to discuss. And the way we do that is not by shutting off or delinking, but rather by shifting our production in a way that balances the needs for safety and soundness, as well as comparative advantage. So I think those are the kind of issues that are being discussed right now, and policymakers have yet to decide what adequate framework we need in order to implement those principles of safety, soundness, and comparative advantage and efficiency.
Bottom on the Chinese market, or to reduce the transfer of technologies, that might have, let's say, security implications. But then, there's people would question, in terms of dependency, the Chinese economy depends on the export market in the US and the European Union. Obviously, it's mutual in terms of dependency. And then when it comes to technologies, how do you distinguish, commercial technologies from, say, technologies with security implications?
That's a great question. And in fact, it's very hard to do that because those are very artificial distinctions in terms of developing a technology and how it's used. But I think to get back to your basic question, which is how is globalization being reshaped, especially when some countries are feeling that they have a need to restrict their exports. I think China's answer to that has been to grow its own domestic market, to grow its market in a way that gives it enough scale to sustain its own technologies and its own development for its own needs. A good example of that is the electric vehicle industry. China has now become a leader in the production of electric vehicles, and that's in part because China has also put in the infrastructure that's needed for electric vehicles. And I think the need to export, is illustrated by saying, well, if we develop our domestic markets well enough, we have a product that is so good and so cost effective, everyone else will want to come and buy and learn how to produce from us. And that's the model that, for example, Tesla has used when it sharpened its production techniques in China, and now it's using China as a base to export to around the world, even though it also looks at China as a huge domestic market in which to redevelop its technology specifically for China. Volkswagen has done the same thing. So I think in terms of de-risking and the kind of policies that are needed for de-risking, China has, I think, pursued a very wise policy, which is to develop its domestic market. And China is big enough that it can sustain the advanced technologies that are needed for 21st century production and trade.
Mm-hmm. Well, Bolton, go ahead.
Well, I think technology is generic by itself. You know, technology from making shoes to making drones, they can be used anywhere. So you can use a knife to do the butcher of the people, and also you can do it in the kitchen. So therefore, I do agree with William that it is really a political maneuverability, really, to make a distinction between military use or civil use whatsoever.
You know, Bolton mentioned about this. So, you know, all those challenges seem, you know, seem to be from this politics, sometimes politicizing of even trade or investment issues. Is that the, you know, the biggest challenge or the risk for the enterprises around the world now?
I think the biggest challenge to enterprises right now is to adapt their entrepreneurship in a way that allows them to really be successful regardless of the political environment. After all, right now, as strong as the political tensions are between the United States and China, we have dream of U.S. CEOs going to China and saying to people, from Bill Gates to Elon Musk to Jamie Dimon to all representatives across the board, saying we are here to do business in China, and we are in China, and we're here in China to stay. And I think that message is resoundingly supportive of the notion that entrepreneurs, given their ways, will be successful regardless of the political environment. Now, you can make it easy for them, or you can make it tough for them. And I think what the lesson from, I think, the Premier's speech is that we need to somehow allow entrepreneurs to thrive, and we should let the political environment make it as easy as possible. And now the question is, how is that? Well, the history of state-inspired entrepreneurship has not been very good. Every country that's tried to do that kind of planning, from Japan to Singapore to the Soviet Union, has not succeeded well in allowing entrepreneurship to thrive if it's directed by the state. Now, you can incentivize the direction of entrepreneurship and say, we want sustainability, we want to reduce carbon emissions. That's great. But to tell people you must innovate in this area because we want to become great in semiconductors, which is what Singapore did, led to a failure because they tried to create a competitor to TSMC, and the Singaporean semiconductor company completely failed regardless of the amount of efforts that was put in there. So it's very tricky how entrepreneurs are successful or not successful, but the history of policies has shown us that if we leave them alone and give them a supportive environment to do an experiment and to fail, that's probably the best way to induce the kind of innovations that are most beneficial for all societies. So I think that's the lesson that I think that the Premier has referred to, and I hope is trying to inspire within China also.
So William, you are all for free trade and you know, a free market, despite the rising tensions geopolitically. You know, of course, you know, China's economy, just like the other economies, you know, they are not isolated. They are not standing alone. It's easily to be affected by the global economic performance globally. So, what's your prediction of this performance of this year? You know, are we seeing, like, say, recovery or strong growth in major economies like, you know, Germany, European economies, the U.S., and Japan, for example?
Well, the pandemic has really made policymaking and macro policymaking very difficult because coming out of a pandemic, everyone was so afraid that we were weakened by the pandemic so much that they overstimulated the economies in the West, especially the United States. And so we're fighting inflation right now. And as a result of that fight for against inflation and trying to lower inflation, a lot of the activity has been slowed down as well. And as a consequence, the feedback back to China has been a fall off in export orders, not just from the United States, but from the entire world as countries are trying to fight inflation. So you're absolutely right that China's future is partly tied to what's going on with the inflation fight abroad. But I think China's policymakers have also tried very much to boost its domestic economy so that they can be much more self-sustaining and self-perpetuating. But the limits to fiscal policy are also found in China, where the debt burdens of the local governments have restricted their ability to apply the kind of infrastructure spending and property market support that they did in the past. So China is also facing a tricky part of policymaking where lowering interest rates may not be enough to incentivize people to invest without the kind of optimism that comes from a booming domestic market. And I think that's the challenge that China is trying to face now, is to offset the weakness abroad with strength at home.
Yeah, well, with that, we come to the end for today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qianzhuo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.